Let's talk about how to storyboard and the best panel layouts for your Webtoon Short Story Contest script. Hey, Walter here, doing what I can to make comics easier because it shouldn't be overwhelming or daunting telling your story. And today I'm going to try to puke out everything I know about storyboarding, thumbnailing, panel layout, whatever you want to call it, hopefully in a clear and concise manner. So get ready because there is a lot of information. And the first thing we're starting off with is the very most important thing ever, is that when you're thumbnailing your comics, you should thumbnail them with the lettering, with the dialogue in mind. When you're drawing your little stick figures and stuff, also draw placeholders for the word balloons. This is going to save you a lot of headaches in the future because it sucks when you have to figure out how to fit in all of these words into artwork where there is no room for it and you have to stick it in a weird place, or you have to smash it in there, make it smaller, or worse sin of ever, you have to cover the artwork. So plan your thumbnailings with the lettering, with the word balloons in your drawings, and it will save you a ton of headaches and it will make your comic look way better. Now this is a little easier to get away with Webtoons because you have such huge gutters that you can put the lettering into, but I would still highly suggest that you do your thumbnailing with the lettering in there. And speaking of gutters, gutters is a magical white space in comic books. Time passes, action happens within the gutters, and so you have to kind of create this logical leap for the readers because they're going to be taking these jumps when they're reading your comic. So you have to give them enough information to make that logical leap. So imagine I draw a character walking down the street. In the very next panel, he's opening a door. What happened? Where did that door come from? Is this the same day? Is it tomorrow? Maybe it's a completely different guy who just happens to look the same. Maybe it's his evil twin. So we redraw this first panel to show the door in the first panel. Then we use the same second panel. Now it's more obvious and the reader can make that logical jump. The story, the art, the layouts, the lettering all work to pull the reader along on a journey. All right, so let's talk about different camera shots or different panel layouts. This is basically going to be how far or how close the camera is to the objects that we're focusing on. So if the camera is really far away, we have the wide or establishing shot. These are usually to start off a story or start off a scene. It tells the reader where and when we are. Is it the future, the past? Is it a rich person's house? Are we in the slums? It sets the scene. We start with this so the reader isn't wondering where the characters are when they really should be paying attention to the story. If you want your readers to be confused or lost because of story reasons, you could always not use the establishing shot to make the reader feel those same emotions that the character might be feeling. But you really need to be aware of what you're doing and what is going to happen when you do it. Now there are some other camera shots as you move the camera in closer, like long shots, but I'm going to call anything that shows the location or the environment, whether interior or exterior, an establishing shot. And also with establishing shot, the more work that you put into your establishing shot, the less work you have to do in the remaining panels in that scene, because the reader is going to use their imagination and fill in the gaps for the backgrounds when you don't draw the backgrounds. So establishing shots are really super important, and you really want to start the scenes off with them unless you have some kind of reason not to. Next is the full shot. This is going to give you a full body view of the character or characters and a decent amount of background. This is a great way to show certain actions happening, jumping, picking stuff up, or interacting with the environment. This is really more for focusing on the environment or the action and not so much for facial emotions. And then you got mid shots, which is like half the body. Similar to full, but closer, not so much background, and we're really just worried about what the upper body is doing. We can see a little bit more emotion with this shot. Then you got the headshot. This is now where you can see a lot of emotion the character is feeling, and there are different degrees to the headshot. You can have the close-up, the extreme close-up, and the nose hair close-up. Besides the distance from the camera and the object, you also have a height difference. You can have the overhead view where the camera is looking down, or you can have the underhead view, the undershot, the worm eye view, whatever you want to call it, where the camera is lower than eye level and looking up, and then of course you have all the distances in between those shots. If you place the camera higher than the character, it tends to make the character feel weaker, like you're looking down on them, you're more powerful than that character. If the camera is placed lower than the character, it makes the character feel bigger and stronger, and this can be true, but it also depends on what's happening in the rest of the story as well. Just pay attention to where the camera is, what the height is versus the character or the object height that we're looking at, and think about what it is saying to the reader. So that's just a general guideline. It's really going to depend on what's happening in the story as well. Like if you draw a character looking all cool and badass and you have the camera looking down at him, he's still going to feel powerful. So you really need to think about what's going on in the story, what you're trying to do with the camera, and kind of put all of that in perspective for what you're trying to show or do. In general, I try to stay away from huge overhead shots. They're really useful for telling a story or showing a lot of information. Like if you need to set up a scene, if you have an overhead shot, you can show pretty much an entire room or an entire city or an entire planet or an entire spaceship. So it's really useful, but the reason I don't like them is because you have to draw so much information to make those panels look full, make them look believable, make them feel like they have life. So I try to stay away from those unless I really have to use them. So I like to stay with lower shots because it's an easy way to create depth. It puts the reader in the scene with the characters, and there's a lot of room for using foreground, midground, and background shots to create a huge amount of depth for the reader and make that panel feel believable and alive. The other thing is flow of action. The reader is reading from left to right. So if you have the action moving from left to right, that creates a lot more momentum for the action that's actually happening. If you try to move from right to left, you're working against the reader, and it can slow down the action. It makes it feel a little bit slower, a little bit less impactful. So try to move in the same direction that the reader is moving. Another weird thing about this flow of action is that if you put a hero on the left side of the panel, they're going to be more heroic. If you put a villain on the right side of the panel, they're going to feel more villainous. And I think it has something to do with the fact that the hero on the left side is looking or moving in the same direction as the reader, so they feel connected. The reader feels connected with the hero, where the villain, if they're looking to the left, they're working against the reader, so they feel like they're antagonizing the flow that the reader is having. And I believe this is like an old theater trick where the hero would enter from the left side of the stage, where the villain would end up entering from the right side of the stage. So I think this is a carryover from that. And this could be true, this could work, it could be total bubkiss and mean nothing at all. But art is pretty much made up, and we're all just kind of tricking ourselves into believing that this is real and that it is all meaningful. So, you know, you can do whatever you want, but these are just like fun little tricks that could or could not work to make your comic a little bit better. Tied in with this flow of action is the 180-degree rule. I have another video where I explain this in detail, but imagine you have two characters standing across from each other and you draw a straight line that goes between them, and you put the camera on one side of that line. This is where the 180 rule comes in place. If you want to rotate that camera, move the camera around, that's fine, but it has to stay on the one side of that line that you drew. It can't go over 180 degrees and cross that line and come back on the other side. The reason we do this is because it can create confusion for the reader, because you will see a character on the left side of a panel, and if you move the camera all the way around, it puts them on the other side of the panel, which can confuse the reader because it seems like that character all of a sudden like teleported to a new location, and it's a little weird for the reader. Now that can actually be kind of cool if you're trying to keep the reader confused and kind of keep them off kilter if your character is going through that same emotion. So there are reasons for using that, but you want to pay attention and make sure that you're not using it incorrectly or you're causing more confusion than you want to. So just pay attention to what you're doing. You can break the rule. You can break any of these rules. They're just guidelines, but just know what you're doing. And just a couple quick tips. If you want to make one character feel stronger or more powerful than another character, angle the camera so that that character looks taller than the other character. If you want to create a sense of creepiness, shoot a character from behind so they can't actually see what's going on because they're looking the wrong way. Now, how do you take all of this information and actually use it to storyboard or thumbnail your comic? Let's dive into that. So the first thing you want to do is read the panel description and decide what's the most important thing happening in that panel. Is it the location or the environment? Is it something that the character is doing? Or is it an emotion on the character's face? And then set up your camera specific to what you think is important. If it's the location, then yeah, you're gonna have to pull back and do your establishing shot. If it's the pose, if it's the action like punching somebody or jumping over something, you're gonna want a full shot or a mid shot. If it's all about the emotion, then you wanna come in close on the face so we can really see that emotion. Another thing you wanna do with that though is be careful. You don't wanna just use the same panel every single time. Like, you don't want just a bunch of establishing shots. That's kind of boring. You don't want a bunch of close-ups on the face showing emotion like over and over again. It gets a little boring. So you want to like vary the types of panels you're using. So like, what would you do if you had a scene where the characters are talking most of the time and it's all about the emotion? You can still pull back and show body language. Depending on how the body is, you can figure out if they're angry or if they're scared of the other person they're talking about. So think about pulling back, showing some stuff. You know, if they're talking about a particular object, you could come in close on that object and put it closer to the camera, and then you see the characters talking further in the background. And that's a really good way to create depth, because that's the other big thing you want to do when you're thinking about your panels, is you want to create depth. And so we have these things called the foreground, the midground, and the background. And basically that's just saying how close certain things are to the camera. And if you can take objects in the foreground which are close to the camera like this, and then you have me in the midground, and then you have the background in the background, that creates a lot of depth. And if you can overlap those individual elements, then that creates way more depth. Like if I'm sitting here and I put my hand here, it's not overlapping me, it's overlapping the background. But if I suddenly put it in front of my face, this is going to create more depth for the reader. So you want to try to overlap these objects and create that sense of depth for the reader. It kind of makes them feel like they're in the scene with the characters, and that's a really great way to make people feel more connected to your story and to your characters. Another thing that new artists tend to do is to draw their panels with the camera straight on the action, where you have like two characters standing across from each other and the camera is just pointing like straight directly in between them. Now this is perfectly fine. It can tell the story, but it doesn't create as much depth. Everything kind of feels flat because everything is parallel to the camera. So what you want to do is you want to create angles with your camera. Put the camera behind someone's shoulder looking at the other character, aim it down, you know, basically get all of those angles around that 180-degree line that we talked about earlier. And this is going to help create a sense of depth. Put things in the foreground, put things in the background, and, you know, move the camera around as the characters are doing different things and acting. But remember, keep in mind the 180-degree rule. Keep in mind the flow of action and all of that stuff. I know it's a lot, but you know, as you keep making more comics, you'll start seeing these things. It'll start becoming second nature, where you don't even think about it. But you have to make a whole bunch of comics to do that. So don't worry too much about the rules. Kind of stick them in the back of your head. Come back, you know, to this video or other videos, and then you'll hear that same rule again, and you'll be like, oh yeah. Oh yeah. And then, you know, as you're making your next comic, you kind of think about that. And then the next time you make another comic, you don't even think about it. You just do it naturally. The next thing I want to talk about is dynamic panels or extreme foreshortening. Everybody loves these types of panels, and yeah, they create a ton of action, but they're also really hard to draw, and if you do them incorrectly, it can create a lot of confusion for the reader because it's going to make them look in the wrong place. Or if the foreshortening is too extreme, they might not be able to understand exactly what they're looking at, and that's going to take them out of the story with the time they spend trying to figure out exactly what they're looking at. So personally, I usually stay away from all these dynamic panels where characters are breaking the border. Like, you know, that means their hand is going outside of the panel border. And that's a way to create depth if you want to, but it can make the character point to some place where you don't want the reader to go. So you have to pay attention to all that stuff. I personally don't use them, like I said. That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. Artists that are way, way, way more talented and better at storytelling than I use those things. For me, I just like to keep it simple, and I don't want to confuse the reader. And so the more simple I keep things, the better, stronger my storytelling is for myself. But like I said, if you want to use that stuff, go ahead, more power to you. Rock it out, dynamic, extreme, to the max. The final thing I want to talk about is the size of the panel itself. You kind of have to look at what's going on in that particular panel. Is it something that is worth having a huge, big scrolling panel? And these are great for like action shots or for establishing shots where you need to show more information. But if it's just a character talking, you don't need a huge, tall panel of just their face. That's going to be weird. You have to think about the fact that the reader needs to scroll through this, and they're not going to be able to see the character's entire face. So you might see like the angry eyes, but then you're going to scroll past the eyes until you finally see the mouth. So you got to think about, like, does this panel really need to be large? And if it does, go ahead and do that. If it doesn't, don't feel the need to make the panel huge. It's going to look fine on small phone screens, even if you make smaller panels. For me personally, I think a good general rule of thumb is to have most of your panels around 500 pixels tall. This is going to be a great size for computer monitors. You got to remember, computer monitors are more wide than they are tall. So if you make really tall panels, people on their computer aren't going to be able to see your entire panel. If you keep it to 500 pixels tall, they will be able to see your entire panel. And for people who are reading on their phone, which a lot of people do for Webtoon, they are going to be able to see the entire panel, but they're also going to be able to see your dialogue. So they'll be able to read the dialogue while enjoying the artwork. So I think 500 pixels is really good unless you have a reason to do a big, long scrolling panel, which is really great for establishing shots like showing an entire town or space or a spaceship or any of that stuff. So just put some thought in that. Every panel doesn't have to be a huge, giant panel. Okay, so that is everything I could think of. My big suggestion is to keep it simple. Clarity before cool, storytelling before dynamic, you being you before trying to be somebody else. What is the hardest part of thumbnailing for you? Did this video help? Do you still have more questions? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to keep making comics easier, make sure you hit that subscribe button to catch another video for more sweet, sweet goodness. Peace. Oh yeah.